Under a sky smeared with charcoal clouds, the village of Enkilu waited breathlessly. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the wet shuffle of royal guards dragging a limp figure across the muddied courtyard. Aanda, a girl no older than 16, barely resisted. Her arms were scraped raw, her feet bare and blistered, but her eyes, those wide brown eyes, stayed steady on the palace looming above them. She had not screamed when they accused her of witchcraft. She had not wept when they announced her punishment. It was a cruel thing how quickly a village could turn on one of its own. Just yesterday she had fetched water for the baker's wife and soothed the crying toddler outside the weaver's hut. But that was before the crops yellowed, before the winds refused to blow, before the chieftain's son fell sick. Now her presence was a stain, her silence interpreted as guilt. The guards reached the center of the courtyard and forced her to her knees. An old wooden post, once used for ceremonial speeches, stood tall like a forgotten ancestor. Without ceremony, they tied her wrists behind her back and fastened her to it with coarse rope. Her head slumped forward. Her thin dress clung to her, soaked from the early drizzle that had begun an hour before. Around her, the villagers gathered in a hesitant circle, sheltered under hoods and mats of woven grass. Their faces flickered with discomfort, curiosity, and in some, a hidden satisfaction. They were told she had cursed the grain stores, called worms to devour the roots, and whispered to the rain to stay away. It was strange because they had never heard Aanda whisper anything to anyone. She had always been quiet. The chieftain's wife stood in a carved wooden archway, her crimson robe brilliant against the gray sky. Her gold bracelets clinked as she raised a hand for silence. "Let this be a lesson," she called out, her voice sharp as a knife's edge. "Let no servant forget her place. The gods do not take kindly to defiance." No one cheered. There were no murmurs of agreement. Only the sound of the rain intensifying, now slapping rooftops and running down the palace walls in narrow streams. And there was Aanda still tied to the post, eyes closed as if in prayer. Then something peculiar happened. The rain shifted. Not in direction, not in intensity, but in sound. The pattering that echoed across the courtyard began to bend, to stretch into something melodic. It was as though the droplets, in their descent, struck invisible strings in the air. A hum emerged, not a note from any instrument they knew, but a vibration deep enough to settle in bone and marrow. Aanda's name. Aanda. It started as a whisper. The first to hear it was a child, who tugged at her mother's cloak and asked, "Why is the rain speaking her name?" The mother shushed her, but her own eyes were wide with disbelief. More villagers heard it next. The syllables rose and fell, braided into the storm itself. It was not shouted or screamed, but gently sung, as if the sky itself had known Aanda far longer than they had. Aanda. The guards exchanged glances, one of them stepping backward unconsciously. The palace hounds, usually fierce and disciplined, began to whimper and paw at the ground. And still Aanda didn't move. Some said they saw light in her eyes. Others claimed the ropes began to smoke where they touched her skin, not from fire but from a slow unraveling of some deeper power. But no one dared interrupt. The chieftain's wife backed away, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her gold bangles no longer shone, they looked tarnished under the gray sky. The hum grew louder. Aanda. It was not just her name now, it was her memory, her kindness, her silence. It was the moment she handed bread to the crippled beggar, the time she stayed awake with the village healer when everyone else had gone home. The rain sang her deeds, soaked in every echo of the girl they had chosen to punish. Then Aanda opened her eyes. They were no longer brown. They were a deep, swirling silver, like the storm clouds themselves had descended into her gaze. A few villagers dropped to their knees. One woman screamed and ran. The rest remained rooted, unsure whether to flee or bow. Aanda spoke. Or perhaps it was the rain through her lips. "You watched," she said, though her lips barely moved. "You let silence speak for you. But the storm remembers. The rain listens." A wind coiled through the courtyard, tearing mats from heads and rattling wooden beams. It wrapped around Aanda like a cloak, fluttering her soaked dress. The ropes fell off her wrists, not snapped, not burned, simply gone. Melted into the mist that clung to the ground. She stepped forward. No one dared stop her. The guards dropped their spears. One of them wept, repeating her name like a chant. The chieftain's wife stumbled back into the shadows of the palace, suddenly looking much older. Aanda walked through the crowd. Where she stepped, the earth dried. The mud shrank back, the air warmed, and the storm shifted, no longer wrathful but reverent. As she passed, people lowered their eyes, some in shame, others in awe. She did not speak again. She didn't need to. The storm carried her voice, carried her presence, and it trailed behind her like a royal procession. By the time she reached the edge of the village, the rain had stopped. Only the whisper remained, echoing through the thatched roofs and palace halls. Aanda. Aanda. And long after she vanished into the forest beyond the rice fields, the name clung to the stones, danced in the rivers, and hummed through the palace walls. The people would never forget what they had seen, or what they had heard, because the rain never forgot her name. And now neither would they. The palace stood tall and proud on the hill, its marble floors untouched by mud and its golden ceilings glinting with opulence. But tonight, something unnatural stirred beneath the grandeur. The rain outside hadn't stopped since Aanda had been tied to the post. It lashed the stone walls like it was trying to break in, like it was mourning, like it was remembering. Inside, the queen lay wide awake. Her chambers, though sealed shut and wrapped in thick velvet drapes, echoed with the steady tap-tap-tap of water. She sat up suddenly, convinced that someone had entered her room. There was no one. But on the far wall, where a painting of her wedding day hung, a dark stain had begun to bleed through the plaster. Water. Cold, dark water. Dripping slowly. The queen ran her hand over it, and though her fingers came away wet, the wall itself remained whole. No crack, no pipe, no source, only the water that shouldn't be there. In the hallway, the guards had started to whisper too. "The rain's got a voice," one muttered under his breath. Another swore he heard singing when he passed the southern wing. The courtyard, once bustling with visitors and royal audiences, now lay empty and slick with water. And at its center, the post where Aanda had been tied still stood. Empty now. She had been untied once the storm worsened, her punishment deemed complete. But she hadn't returned to the servant quarters. No one knew where she had gone. Some said she vanished with the rain. Others claimed to have seen her walking barefoot along the palace walls, her wet dress trailing like fog. Yet none could prove it. What they could prove, however, was that nothing had been the same since. In the prince's chambers, things had begun to decay in silence. The sacred scrolls laid out on his study table were meticulously crafted and blessed by the kingdom's highest priests, scrolls detailing his lineage, his destiny, his coming ascension. But now the ink was smudged. Entire names washed away. His own name was gone from every parchment. At first he blamed the servants. But when fresh scrolls were brought and locked in a golden box, they too dissolved into water by dawn. Frustrated, the prince shouted at his advisors, cursed the scribes, and ordered daily prayers to cleanse his space. Still, the scrolls refused to hold his name. Meanwhile, the servants spoke in hushed tones near the kitchen fire. One girl, barely 10, claimed that when she passed the main fountain, she heard someone call her name from the water. Another whispered that the bath drawn for the queen turned black when left unattended. They were told to stop talking nonsense, to focus on their duties. But they knew something ancient was shifting. A truth older than the kingdom, deeper than blood, was knocking against their walls. The king remained unaware for days. His time was consumed by council meetings and threats of famine. The crops were failing and his advisors feared rebellion. But the king didn't believe in curses or rain spirits. Not until the dream. It came without warning. One night he saw himself walking through the courtyard, the rain falling soft and warm. Ahead, a figure stood, small, delicate, with glowing eyes and a voice like wind over water. "You forgot me," she said, not with anger but with sorrow. "You listened to their fear and not the truth." When the king tried to approach her, vines of water rose from the ground and wrapped around his legs. He screamed and fell only to wake in his bed, soaked. The silk sheets clung to him, his pillow dripping as if dipped in a stream. The fire was still burning in the hearth. The windows locked tight. Yet water pooled beneath his bed. That morning he didn't speak of the dream. But when he entered the throne room he paused. A trail of wet footprints led from the door to his throne. No one else seemed to see them. Outside the rain still fell. But now it sounded less like weather and more like weeping. And behind the palace walls, Aanda's name was being whispered, not by people but by the very stones. The palace, built to withstand time, now trembled softly with every syllable of her name. The tapestries flapped without wind. The chandeliers tinkled without touch. And somewhere in the inner sanctum, a portrait of the royal family had begun to fade. Not entirely, only Aanda's face, the one hidden in the background, almost forgotten. She had once been a playmate to the prince when they were children, before she was reassigned to servant duties. That connection, buried beneath years of silence, was now being uncovered. Not by hands, but by the water which peeled back the paint like skin. The queen, frightened beyond reason, summoned the high priest. He arrived drenched in ceremonial garb, beads soaked and bones rattling. He placed offerings at every door. He burned herbs and chanted in the old tongue. But when he tried to speak Aanda's name aloud, the fire in the brazier hissed and died. The room filled with mist and a crack split across the floor under his feet. He fled without finishing the ritual. The queen collapsed in tears. By now, even the walls of the royal nursery were damp. The infant princess refused to sleep, crying only when it rained. Her cries were soft compared to the sound of her toys, which moved on their own, dripping despite being made of cloth. Nurses came and went, always soaked, always quiet. The prince, sensing something ancient unraveling, tried to remember Aanda's face. He recalled a day when they'd played near the orchard, before he'd been told not to associate with the servants. She had told him the names of the flowers in the rain. He'd forgotten most of them. But now, as the petals in the royal gardens began to bloom out of season, always during the rain, he remembered the one she'd called Storm Heart. It was blooming now, everywhere, even in places where the soil had died. In desperation, the king summoned his council and demanded answers. But none came. Only more silence, broken by the constant, steady hum of rain tapping on the palace roof like a distant drumbeat. The oldest of his council finally stood and said quietly, "The girl is not a curse. She is a mirror. And we have forced her to reflect what we refuse to see." The king dismissed him in anger. But the words lingered. That night, Aanda was seen again by the kitchen boy who woke to fetch water. He claimed she stood outside the palace gates, not touching them, just standing with rain falling around her. Her eyes glowed faintly. Her hair was slick and matted. But she smiled at him. The next morning, the palace gates were open. No one had touched them. The king himself stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the courtyard, watching rain pool into the shape of a girl. A girl whose name now haunted every wall of his kingdom. Aanda was born on a night when lightning cracked the sky wide open and the rivers overflowed like they were trying to reach her crib. Her mother, Leone, had laughed through the pain, even as thunder rattled the wooden hut. "She comes with a storm in her chest," Leone had whispered, wrapping the newborn in a cloth soaked from the roof's leak. The villagers came the next morning not with gifts but with cautious eyes, whispering that no child born in such a tempest could bring peace. But Aanda didn't cry. She stared at the rain instead, blinking slowly, like she already knew its rhythm. By the time she was 4, she could hum songs no one had taught her. When asked where she learned them, she would point to the sky and say, "The rain sings when you're not scared." Her voice was calm, too calm for a child. The other children avoided her. Animals, oddly enough, didn't. Birds nested closer to her window. Dogs followed her around the village. Cats curled against her without asking. Even goats would pause near her and blink as if trying to understand something only she knew. Her mother, the village's most trusted healer, would smile and say, "She carries the memory of clouds." But nothing stirred fear like Aanda's way of speaking during rain. During storms, she'd go quiet, eyes glazed over as if listening to a far-off song. Then she'd speak names, people's names, without context. And hours later, those people would fall ill, break a bone, or receive word of bad news. Some called her cursed. Her mother always said, "She's not cursing, she's echoing." But the difference was lost on those who feared what they couldn't control. When Aanda was 7, her mother fell ill. No herbs worked. No chants helped. Leone whispered something in Aanda's ear before dying, a strange name the girl would never repeat. After the funeral, her hut was burned down. The villagers claimed her mother had dabbled too far. Aanda was dragged to the palace gates and offered as a servant, a way for the village to rid itself of guilt without confronting truth. The queen did not want her. But she accepted her, out of duty, not kindness. Aanda was made to scrub floors, sweep ashes, and avoid looking directly at the royals. She did it all without complaint. The rain, however, did not forget her. It followed her through corridors, tapping insistently at windows wherever she walked. When others mopped the floors, they dried. When Aanda mopped, puddles formed in her wake. The queen began to suspect. Her personal gardens bloomed too early whenever Aanda passed. A necklace she'd lost was found dangling from a vine, after Aanda walked through the courtyard. Once, during a diplomatic dinner, Aanda stood behind the throne while the queen spoke of alliances. It began to rain indoors. A fine mist gathered in the chandelier and fell like tears over the queen's hair. Everyone watched. The queen sent Aanda away for weeks after that, into the deepest parts of the servant quarters. That didn't stop the whispers. Some said she spoke to puddles. Others claimed she could make water boil or freeze by humming to it. Many started leaving bowls of rainwater outside her room, hoping to trap luck. The queen grew paranoid. She ordered her guards to monitor the girl. When crops failed and a merchant slipped on palace steps, it was Aanda they blamed. "The rain," said one nobleman, "listens to her. And that is dangerous." Aanda did not beg for forgiveness when accused. She simply looked at the clouds gathering above the palace and whispered, "It is not me the rain answers to. It is memory." The queen slapped her and ordered her tied to the courtyard post. "Let the rain that loves you so much come fetch you then." As they bound her hands and tightened the ropes, Aanda did not cry. The sky grumbled low. Not thunder. A murmur. Like a name forming in a giant mouth. And even though no one admitted it aloud, those who watched her knew something ancient was watching too. Tied to the post, her arms stiff and cold, Aanda let her chin fall forward as the first crack of thunder rolled across the distant hills. Her soaked dress clung to her body, and her feet were half buried in a puddle of mud. Rain slid across her shaved scalp like a second skin, caressing her like a mother's hand. She was not alone. The guards had long since gone back under the palace arches, leaving her to the storm and the silence. The villagers, afraid of being cursed by association, had scattered back to their huts. But the storm had stayed. It had deepened. And with every drop that fell, something shifted. Aanda began to hum, not because she expected help, not because she had any strength left to fight, but because the memory came uninvited. A lullaby. Her mother's voice from a night long gone. Before the selling. Before the silence. Before the walls of the palace swallowed her whole. Asterisk, O Bika Fezulu. The clouds remember your name. Asterisk. The melody curled through her lips like smoke, soft but steady, vibrating through her ribs, echoing against the stone courtyard. At first it seemed like the sound was being stolen by the storm. But as she continued, something odd happened. The rain began to hum back. A low vibration danced across the puddles. The rhythm of her song came back to her, mirrored in the pattering of the rain. The wind seemed to carry a harmony as if invisible voices had joined her. Aanda's breath caught. Her eyes fluttered open. Droplets no longer struck the ground in random chaos. They gathered in patterns, forming symbols in the mud. Circles. Spirals. Echoes of the carvings her mother once etched on gourds and bones. The air grew heavy, not with fear but with remembering. Then the voices began. They did not sound like thunder nor like wind. They were human, almost whispered but clear. Male, female, old, young, an overlapping chorus. He killed the priest, one droplet hissed as it landed on her shoulder. She poisoned the crops, said another, striking the mud beside her foot. They buried the truth beneath the old fig tree. He wears the lion's ring but he drinks the snake's blood. Aanda's chest tightened. She looked around but no one was there. No torchbearers, no spirits, no ghosts. Only the rain. And it wasn't just speaking. It was remembering. With each second, more droplets joined the chorus. Some slipped down her skin, whispering names. Others pounded the stone ground with accusations. Each accusation was like a heartbeat from the land itself. The courtyard, once a place of judgment, had become a courtroom of truth. The stone beneath her began to steam, not from heat, but from the weight of secrets long buried. She could see faces in the reflections of puddles, faces she knew twisted by guilt. The cook who had whipped her for dropping a plate. The stable boy who watched her change and laughed behind her back. The queen looking on from a carved throne, pretending Aanda didn't exist. She took your mother's herbs, the rain said. Aanda's spine straightened. She wanted the boy. She feared your name. The queen? The queen had known her mother? More images danced in the puddles. Her mother giving herbs to a cloaked figure, a trembling servant boy stealing away with a tiny bundle, a blackened hand slipping something into a boiling pot. Your mother was silenced. The wind hissed. Aanda's mouth parted, trembling. Why now? She whispered aloud. The rain answered, because you remembered. As the words came, the post she was tied to creaked and groaned. Not from wind, but from the vines growing rapidly around it. Ivy had begun to spiral up the wood, green, glowing faintly blue as if the rain had awakened something old. The vines touched the ropes on her wrists, and they disintegrated into wet dust. Aanda stumbled forward, knees shaking, hands free. Her skin was wet and shining, but her face held no fear now. Only something deeper, something ancient. Her eyes flickered with a strange silver light, and the rain no longer hit her violently. It danced around her, swaying to the melody she still hummed under her breath. From the palace balcony, a figure watched. The queen. Wrapped in her golden shawl, she stepped back, frowning. She had heard the thunder, the humming. Now she saw the girl, the servant she had once ordered whipped for stepping too close to the prince, walking freely through the courtyard wrapped in stormlight. "Fetch the guards," she whispered to her maid. But no one moved. The maid stared at the rain with wide, frightened eyes. I can hear my name," she muttered. The queen turned to her sharply. "What did you say?" "My name," the maid repeated, stepping back. "It said my name and what I did. How I lied." In the corridor behind them, more murmurs rose. Guards dropping spears. Advisors turning pale. The whispers were spreading, through stone, through skin, through memory. Back in the courtyard, Aanda touched the ground and the rain surged. Puddles rippled with visions. A baby exchanged in secret, a deal made under candlelight, a ritual interrupted by betrayal. The kingdom's past was bleeding through the present. The thunder cracked again, this time with fury. The storm was no longer just a storm. It was judgment. Aanda stepped forward. Each time her foot touched the ground, the rain formed a word: truth, truth, truth. Villagers had begun to gather again, this time on their own. Drawn not by curiosity but by something deeper. As if the rain had called them by name. And it had. They stood in the downpour watching her. Some cried. Some knelt. Some turned away in shame. One old man reached out and whispered, "She's the echo of her mother. The healer's blood walks again." Aanda raised her hand. The rain paused midair, droplets suspended like stars. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Let them see." In an instant the droplets crashed down, not as water but as visions. Memory. Revelation. People gasped as they were shown their own pasts, the lies they told, the secrets they buried, the oaths they broke. No one could hide. The rain had recorded it all. The queen screamed from the balcony, "Stop her! Silence her!" But her voice was swallowed by the storm. Aanda turned her face upward, rain racing down her cheeks like tears. She was not crying. She was receiving. Every whisper from the past, every injustice ignored, every betrayal, washed to her like messages etched in water. Her body felt weightless and strong at once. A child stepped forward from the crowd. A girl no older than 7, holding a torn doll. "Why are you not afraid?" she asked. Aanda knelt to her level. The rain made a soft curtain around them. "Because I am made of what they fear." The girl touched Aanda's hand, and the rain around her shimmered with joy. The storm was no longer violent. It was alive. Awake. Aanda rose and walked slowly across the courtyard. The post behind her cracked in two and fell, vines blooming from its base. No one stopped her. No one dared. She stepped past guards who now stood with heads bowed. Past nobles who shielded their faces. Past servants who fell to their knees. The palace gates swung open with a single touch. And the rain followed her. It would follow her for a long, long time. Because the rain remembered. And now so did everyone else. The storm had not eased since dawn. Thunder grumbled low like an old beast circling the palace walls, and rain painted the windows in ceaseless patterns. While most of the palace stayed hidden behind silk curtains and locked doors, one small figure moved with quiet determination through the corridors. The young Princess Zinal, barely 12 summers old, tiptoed past sleeping guards and ducked beneath ancient tapestries. She had overheard the whispers, about a girl tied to the post, a curse, and the way the rain kept saying her name. Zinal didn't believe in curses. But she did believe in the sadness she had seen once in the eyes of a servant girl who brought her water, eyes that carried a weight far too old for her age. Clutching her little lantern, she stepped out into the rain. The courtyard was nearly empty now. Most had retreated indoors, unnerved by how the rain seemed to sing rather than fall. Zinal moved slowly, her royal slippers soaked through in seconds. Her gaze fixed on the dark shape tied to the post. She hadn't expected her to still be there. She had assumed someone would have untied her by now, or that the king would change his mind. Aanda's head was bowed, drenched, unmoving. Zinal crept closer. The humming, low, strange, wordless, grew louder. It wasn't coming from Aanda's mouth, but from somewhere around her, as though the air itself trembled with sound. Zinal felt goosebumps ripple up her arms. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the rope around Aanda's wrist, and a jolt ran up her arm. The rope was hot, scalding. It should have been wet and cold in the rain, but it hissed against her skin like burning iron. Zinal recoiled with a cry, her palms already blistering red. Aanda's eyes flicked open briefly. They glowed faintly, not like fire but like wet stone kissed by moonlight. Zinal stumbled backward, stunned. Aanda didn't speak. She didn't need to. The humming changed. It shaped itself into something almost like speech. Not words, not quite, but impressions. Regret. Anger. Memory. She turned and ran. The rain followed her, not falling harder but folding around her. When she reached her chambers, the door slammed behind her of its own accord. She dropped the lantern, heart pounding, lungs tight with questions she didn't know how to ask. She stood before her favorite mirror, trying to understand what she had just seen, what she had just felt. Then the fog began. First one mirror clouded over with thick mist, then another. All 5 mirrors in her room turned white with condensation, though the air was not cold enough. She wiped the nearest one with her sleeve, only to find words etched there as though by an invisible finger. One word. Over and over again. Listen. She spun around. Nothing. No whisper. No sound. She looked again. The word was written on all 5 mirrors. And on the windows. And the polished frame of her bed. Her lips trembled. Listen to what? No one answered. But deep in her chest, Zinel felt something shift. A sense that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the world was waiting to show her what lay below. She tried to sleep but could not. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Aanda's face, rain-matted hair, lips slightly parted, and a soundless plea buried in her gaze. And that strange warmth that had burned her hand, how could that have been real? At dawn, the blisters on her hands had faded, but silvery lines remained, as though the ropes had left their memory etched into her skin. Zinel said nothing during breakfast. The queen barely noticed her silence, too distracted by the sudden cracks forming in the eastern wall of the palace. The king stormed about, demanding answers from the royal architects. Zinel watched them all, wondering if any of them had seen the word. If the mirrors had spoken to anyone else. Or if, somehow, they had spoken only to her. And if they had, why her? That night, when she returned to her chamber, there were no words on the mirrors. But a single droplet of water hung from each one, right in the center, not falling, not moving, suspended in air. She touched one. It melted instantly against her skin and echoed a single sound deep in her ear. A voice not quite hers. A memory not quite hers. A name. The truth. Aanda. The rain was not finished. And neither was the girl at the post. The storm had ended hours ago. The sky over the kingdom was a soft gray canvas, and not a single drop fell from the clouds. Yet inside the palace water dripped. Not from the roof or the gutters or a broken vase, but from the walls themselves. It started in the eastern hall. A young servant boy, barely old enough to carry a tray, slipped on a puddle that hadn't been there a moment ago. He looked up. The stone wall was weeping. Thin rivulets streamed down like tears, pooling quietly on the marble floor. No broken pipe. No rain outside. Just water, seeping from within the palace as if the building itself had begun to grieve. By mid-morning the phenomenon had spread. Courtiers rushed through corridors with soaked hems and wet sandals. Scrolls curled in their frames. Silk tapestries sagged from invisible moisture. Still no storm came. In the grand throne room the king paced slowly. His gold-hemmed robe clung to his skin, damp without explanation. Each time he passed a pillar, a wet shape appeared behind him. Once the outline of a dagger next a child's palm, then a crown split into halves. The advisors noticed but said nothing. None dared to speak of symbols carved in water. In the dining hall, the queen sat in silence, watching a drop trail from the ceiling to the rim of her goblet, then spiral into her wine like a whisper dropped into blood. She didn't drink. Servants whispered that Aanda had not moved from the post, not slept, not cried. She merely hummed. The same melody. Over and over. And as she hummed, the palace responded. The head priest summoned the king privately. He claimed ancient texts spoke of the element-bound, souls tied not by blood but by nature. Aanda, he warned, might be one of them. A vessel not just of spirit but of rain itself. The king silenced him with a look and had him escorted out. But still the palace wept. That night the impossible happened. The central hallway, used only for royal processions, flooded. Not trickled. Not dripped. Flooded. A corridor lined with torches and ancestral portraits, now chest-deep in water. Yet outside the skies remained empty. No storm, no wind. Just stillness. Guards sent to investigate did not return. Hours passed. Finally, a soldier was found slumped against the hallway entrance, face pale, eyes open, lungs full of water. The hallway itself had gone dry again. Floor untouched, walls clean, no evidence of moisture. Only the drowned man remained. Panic took root. The princess, frightened yet curious, wandered the mirror room again. This time the fogged surfaces did not bear just a word. They shimmered with phrases. She listens. You lied. We remember. Her breath caught. Behind her reflection she saw another girl, bald-headed, eyes glowing faintly, watching. In the royal library, books warped under the weight of unseen damp. Pages turned themselves as though desperate to be read. A scholar screamed that names in historical scrolls had vanished, ink lifted clean from the parchment. As if they never existed, he whispered. The queen began muttering in her sleep. Servants heard her through the doors. She sees me, in the puddle. I was only trying to keep the crown. By morning the entire palace smelled of wet earth. The council convened. The walls of the chamber were soaked. One advisor claimed the water on his table had formed the shape of his dead daughter's face. Another wept openly, confessing to a crime no one had accused him of. I took it from the priest's room. I didn't know the girl was watching. The king remained unmoved. He stood at the head of the table, fists clenched. This is trickery, he declared. The girl is cursed. Not sacred. We do not bow to weather. But even he could not deny what came next. That afternoon, a tapestry hanging above the royal bed unraveled by itself. Threads fell one by one until the bare wall behind it was exposed. On the stone, written in liquid letters that evaporated slowly, were 6 words. Set her free or drown in silence. The king ordered the words removed, but no one could touch them. Every time a hand approached, the water on the wall rose like claws. In the council hall, 2 guards accused each other of treason. Their arguments grew louder until both collapsed. Lungs flooded, chests heaving with invisible weight. The royal physician opened their mouths and found droplets forming under their tongues, like the rain had crawled in and nested there. A storm had begun. But it was not outside. Servants deserted their posts. The kitchens remained cold. Fires could not be lit. The hearths hissed with unseen mist. The queen begged her husband to end it. She is just a girl, she said. Why are you afraid of her voice? She is not just a girl, the king snapped. She is the storm. On the 7th night since Aanda was tied to the post, the throne room cracked. Literally. Stones split open like a fault line and water gushed out, not flooding but flowing with purpose. It raced across the room, curled around the king's feet and paused. In the reflection he saw himself, not as a ruler but as a child, terrified, clinging to his mother in a thunderstorm. The water rose. He stumbled back. And then from the walls came a sound no one had heard in generations, the echo of thunder inside stone. The rain wasn't outside. It was here, woven into the very bones of the palace. And it was not asking for permission. That night the final message came. On the doors of every chamber, etched in shimmering silver droplets, appeared a single name. Aanda. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a remembrance. As if the rain was reminding them who they'd tied to a post. As if it was preparing for what came next. The ropes binding Aanda to the post had long since frayed and dissolved, not from the hands of any savior, but from the persistent caress of rain that never stopped speaking her name. She was no longer shivering. The cold no longer claimed her. Her skin, though soaked, pulsed with warmth that didn't come from within, but from the storm above, from the droplets that now obeyed her sorrow like a loyal choir of spirits. That night, as thunder murmured low over the hills, Aanda closed her eyes and let the water draw her under, not to drown her but to show her. The droplets clung to her face, sliding down her cheeks like transparent fingers, guiding her into a vision. The courtyard around her blurred. The world twisted and darkened. She stood in a different room now. Not a memory, not a dream, but something deeper. She was inside the queen's chamber, though her physical body remained tied in the real world. The vision had lifted her into a higher space. In front of her, the queen moved like a shadow made flesh. The woman's gold robes trailed behind her as she knelt by a table, carefully unwrapping a small bundle of powder. The priest sat nearby, humming softly, reading from the sacred texts. Aanda knew this man. He had once placed a blessed mark on her forehead as a child and said, "There is thunder in your spirit." He had been kind. Too kind. He had begun asking questions. Questions the queen didn't want answered. Aanda watched, unable to intervene, as the queen stirred the powder into a steaming cup of tea. It shimmered unnaturally before settling into the liquid like ink into water. The priest drank it, his hand briefly pausing at his throat. Moments later he slumped forward, silent, breathless, gone. The vision shifted. The queen was crying before the court, pointing her finger at Aanda. She cursed him, she had wailed. The servant girl, she walks with whispers in her mouth. And no one questioned her, not even the king. Why would they? She was the queen, and Aanda was only a girl who listened to rain. Aanda screamed inside the vision, but no one heard. Except the rain. When she awoke, it was still night, but something had changed. Her hair, which had always been short and matted, was now growing long in real time. The strands moved like silver threads, not white from age but luminous, like moonlight woven into silk. Each droplet of water seemed to hang on the ends, catching the starlight like gems. People from the palace windows stared in disbelief, unable to look away. She did not cry. Her tears were finished. Now she only listened. The storm pulsed around her like a living heart. The wind bowed at her feet. The rain shifted its rhythm, humming a new song, one of justice, of memory, of truth no longer hidden. Inside the palace, the queen felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her silk sleeves trembled as she poured herself wine. The goblet slipped from her hand and shattered against the marble. The mirror in front of her cracked from the center, revealing not her own face, but Aanda's, silver-haired, silent-eyed. The queen stumbled back, heart racing, mouth dry. The walls around her wept. She called for the king, for the guards, for anyone. But none answered. In the courtyard, Aanda lifted her face to the sky. The storm darkened behind her, a great shadow roiling over the mountains, and yet she stood still, serene, centered. The queen's lies had been pulled from the past and hung like soaked banners across the heavens. The rain had revealed the truth. And now the rain stood with her. The ground around her rippled. Not mud, not puddles, but reflections, mirrors of memory showing anyone who dared look the things they had chosen to forget. The cook saw her own thefts. The guard remembered the night he had looked away. The priest's apprentice saw the queen slip the powder into the tea. None could hide. Not anymore. The queen's secret was no longer hers. It belonged to the rain. Lightning cracked through the sky with a sound like 1,000 drums. The flash split the darkness above Aanda, illuminating her soaked form tied to the wooden post in the palace courtyard. But as the light struck, it did not touch her. It curved, split, danced, flickering around her like a shield, refusing to harm her. Then, without a whisper of wind or the weight of hands, the ropes binding her wrists and ankles began to melt. First, a single strand hissed and vanished like steam. Then another. One by one, they dissolved into droplets, pooling around her feet as if they had been made of sugar and not hemp. The crowd gasped. Some thought they had imagined it. Others backed away, crossing themselves, clutching their beads, muttering protection chants under their breath. Aanda lifted her arms slowly, disbelieving. She had not pulled, had not moved, but now she stood untied, free, and dry beneath the curtain of rain that fell only on her. The droplets did not strike her body. They hovered just above her skin, forming a second skin of shimmering liquid that moved with her, breathing with her. Her eyes, once dull with exhaustion and fear, now glowed softly with a blue hue. The moment her foot stepped forward from the post, the earth beneath her seemed to sigh. A ripple moved through the ground like a breath through silk. The mud, once dark and thick, turned clear, shimmering like silver glass. The pool beneath her reflected not just her image, but the sky, the moon, and every soul watching her. It grew with each step she took, spreading like a mirror through the courtyard. A servant dropped the water jug he was carrying. A guard lowered his spear without realizing. One of the elders in the crowd began to weep, not out of sorrow but relief, as if something ancient and buried was returning. And then they began to kneel. First a child. Then a woman with a baby on her hip. Then 3 farmers. Soon the entire crowd of villagers had sunk to their knees in the rain, heads bowed, eyes closed. No one told them to. No voice commanded. It was instinct, an echo of a time before kings and palaces, when the elements themselves were obeyed. Aanda walked forward, the mirrored path unfolding with her. The air around her carried no thunder now, only a deep, steady hum, like an old lullaby or the resonance of a drum's skin. Her gown, once rags clinging to her body, now swayed with each step like it had weight and grace. The fabric sparkled as if woven with stardust. Her silver-threaded hair flowed behind her, floating slightly in the air as if the rain were lifting it. Above, on the royal balcony, the family stood in frozen silence. The king, stiff and pale, gripped the marble rail so tightly his knuckles turned white. The prince stood behind him, wide-eyed, lips slightly parted. The queen, whose face usually wore either a mask of indifference or rage, had none now. Her expression was blank, emptied of emotion, hollow like a forgotten statue. The princess stood at the edge, closest to the courtyard. Her small fingers pressed against the soaked railing. Unlike the others, she didn't look afraid. Her mouth moved slightly, whispering something to herself. Aanda did not look up at them. Her focus was not on the palace. The rain began to rise, not fall. Droplets lifted from the ground, swirling in a soft spiral. They gathered at Aanda's sides, forming into shapes, limbs, faces, silhouettes. The priest's face emerged briefly in the air. Then her mother's. Then the child who had once drowned in the royal lake. The rain was memory, and now, it revealed everything it had witnessed. Gasps spread through the villagers. Whispers passed from mouth to mouth. She's chosen by the storm. She's the one who listens. She is the rain's own child. Aanda finally stopped in the center of the courtyard. The rain around her stilled. In the silence, one could hear the sound of shifting water, of secrets moving just below the surface. Then a guard stepped forward. He had been one of the two men who tied her to the post. His face was pale, his lips trembling. But he walked, slowly like approaching a god, until he stood at the edge of the mirrored pool. I didn't know, he said. They told us you cursed the land. Aanda looked at him. She did not speak. But the rain around her rippled once, and the man staggered back. A whisper only he heard passed through his ears. He dropped to his knees, covering his face. I'm sorry, he sobbed. One by one more guards knelt. Then the chief advisor. Then servants. Then, eventually, even the high priestess who had declared her a danger weeks before. Still, Aanda said nothing. The queen stepped back from the balcony. Her breath had become ragged. The walls behind her had begun to weep again, water trickling from the stone itself, soaking the royal carpet. She backed away into the shadows of the corridor, as if the rain might find her even there. The king finally broke the silence from above. Stop this, he roared. This is sorcery. Trickery. But no one looked up at him. Not even the prince. Aanda turned her face to the sky. The rain touched her cheeks again, not with force but like the soft caress of a mother's hand. She closed her eyes and her lips moved. No one heard the words, but the clouds parted for just a moment. Light spilled down, not sunlight but something gentler. Pale blue and silver. A soft glow that wrapped the entire courtyard. In that light, wounds began to fade. Bruises lightened. One elderly woman stood without her cane. A young man's limp disappeared. A baby stopped crying and smiled for the first time. The rain had not come for vengeance. It had come for truth, for memory, for healing. And in that moment, Aanda became more than a girl. She became the storm's song. Aanda stepped through the palace gates, each bare foot leaving behind a glowing imprint of wet light on the polished stone floors. The glow pulsed gently, as though each step awakened something buried deep within the walls. The silence in the air was not stillness, it was anticipation, a breath being held by the palace itself. Servants froze where they stood. Guards, hardened men with spears and swords, backed away as if a fire moved toward them. But Aanda brought no fire, only water. And the water followed her. Droplets hovered in the air, forming halos around her head, her shoulders, swirling gently as if taking her form into memory. Her eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now held storms within them. She ascended the marble steps slowly, purposefully. Behind her, the village followed at a distance, not in rebellion but in reverence. Mothers clutched their children close. Elders bowed their heads. None dared interrupt the rhythm of her return. This was not a servant girl walking into the palace. This was something more ancient, more elemental. This was the storm come to collect its due. As Aanda entered the grand hall, the rain that had long followed her no longer fell from the sky, it dripped from the very air. Moisture collected on pillars, shimmered across golden curtains, and trailed down the carvings of former kings. Every surface seemed to weep. The royal family stood on the high platform, eyes wide, lips unable to form sound. The king looked smaller than Aanda remembered, no longer the towering figure who gave cruel commands, but an aging man weighted by fear. The queen trembled, her robes clinging to her like vines. The princess, standing beside them, gazed at Aanda with wide, tear-filled eyes, not of fear but of understanding. Aanda's gaze moved from one face to the next. When she looked at the prince, a black slick of tar seeped from his sleeves, oozing down his arms and pooling at his feet. He stumbled back, staring in horror as the thick substance exposed him. His betrayal of the servant girl who once saved him from a wild dog, his lies to protect his own status, his silence when he knew the truth. Aanda turned to a royal advisor, and a mist poured from his mouth, heavy with the scent of greed. He had taken the priest's scrolls and hidden the truth, written Aanda's name in place of the queen's, sealing her fate. Each person she passed revealed something. From their eyes, from their hands, from their very breath, sins unwound like threads of rot. The air thickened with confession. The ground darkened with shame. When her eyes met the queen's, the effect was instant. The queen let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. Her body jerked as if struck, though no one touched her. Her crown clattered to the floor, rolling until it hit Aanda's foot. Thick streams of ink-black water spilled from the queen's eyes. Her carefully painted lips cracked as bile-colored fog escaped from her mouth. She dropped to her knees, crying out words no one could understand. The king looked between his wife and Aanda, tears flowing freely. He stepped forward, shaking. "Please," he whispered. "Please forgive us. We didn't know. We didn't see." Aanda said nothing. She walked past him, water dripping from her fingers, each drop echoing louder than the last. The storm outside began again, not a downpour but a soft, steady rhythm. As if the sky itself waited for judgment. Then the rain spoke. Its voice did not come from Aanda's mouth, but from every droplet hanging in the air, every stream crawling down the palace walls. It was 1,000 whispers and a single command. "Truth has roots. You tried to burn it." The wind carried the voice through the hall. It struck the tapestries, tore through the heavy air, and wrapped around the throats of the guilty. The villagers outside dropped to their knees. Inside, the palace shook. The queen collapsed completely, face to the floor. The king fell beside her, hands in the air, begging a storm that would not listen to empty words. Aanda continued forward until she reached the central dais. The throne sat before her, empty and glistening with a layer of dew. She did not sit. Instead, she stood at its base and turned to face the gathered crowd of nobles, servants, and strangers. The princess stepped forward from the line of royals. Her small voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" Aanda looked at her for a long moment. The answer did not come from her lips, but from the window behind her, which shattered open as sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The glowing footprints faded. The black tar on the floor dissolved into mist. And the rain, having delivered its judgment, began to slow. But it did not stop. Aanda lowered her gaze. The storm within her eyes calmed. The palace had heard the truth. The land had seen the sin. And the rain had remembered everything. She walked down the steps, past the throne and into the light. Behind her, the palace echoed with a single word over and over in the voice of every drop. "Listen." Aanda walked out of the palace gates as though they had never meant to contain her. Her feet moved slowly at first, but with each step, the rain around her danced more eagerly. The wet ground shimmered beneath her, reflecting not just her image but a silhouette bigger than herself, something ancient and sacred. The wind didn't howl anymore. It whispered. The clouds didn't roar. They hummed as if in awe. As she passed the silent villagers who had once turned away from her cries, they fell to their knees, not in fear, but in reverence. Her eyes were calm, her skin radiant, but what struck them most was the water itself. It clung to her like a second skin, not drenching her but cradling her. The girl was no longer just a girl. She had become something more. Behind her, the palace stood in stunned silence. No soldier dared to follow, no courtier dared to question. The queen had not risen since collapsing in the hall, her lips still trembling with the taste of her own guilt. The king sat alone, his throne soaked in the rain he once mocked. But Aanda didn't look back. She didn't need to. The rain remembered everything. As she moved beyond the walls of the kingdom, tales began to spread. They started as whispers, just like the ones the servants used to trade when no royals were listening. But now the whispers grew into stories and the stories into legends. Children whose mothers were forced into silence found their tongues again when the rains fell. They spoke Aanda's name before any other word. Women who had been wronged heard justice in the rhythm of dripping leaves. Crops once cursed began to bloom under cloudy skies. The land changed not because Aanda willed it, but because the rain carried her spirit across it. In distant villages where the name of the palace was only spoken with contempt, travelers brought news of the girl who had walked through silence and fire, lies and chains, and emerged with thunder in her breath. They told of how lightning bowed to her. How ropes dared not hold her. How kings wept when she passed. They sang of her voice, soft but weighty, though many had never heard it themselves. It was the silence she left behind that carried more power than any scream. There were places she passed where people had not yet heard her story. And yet, when she entered, the wind shifted. Birds flew lower. Old wounds reopened, not to bleed again but to breathe. A man who had never spoken of his daughter's murder found himself weeping under a gray sky. The rain ran down his cheeks, heavy, and he said her name aloud for the first time in years. A woman whose village had buried her shame under shallow graves felt the ground rise when Aanda stepped into town. And beneath her feet, grass grew where no seed had been sown. In these places, Aanda didn't stay long. She never asked for thanks. She didn't even speak. Sometimes she would sit near a river or walk barefoot through a market. She would listen. Always listening. And when the lies around her grew too thick, the sky would darken and justice would fall, sometimes as softly as mist, sometimes as violently as a storm. But always fair. Always complete. In one small village where the chief had taken too many daughters for himself, Aanda merely stood in the center of the square as rain gathered in the bowls of old drums. The rhythm was unmistakable, like footsteps approaching. That night the chief disappeared. They said he drowned, though there was no water near where they found his body. Only wet earth and a crown of reeds placed beside his chest. No one mourned. And the rain was gentle the next morning. Songs were written, not by poets but by grandmothers, by orphans, by strangers who had only caught a glimpse of her silver-lined hair as she passed through a storm. They called her Daughter of the Sky. She who listens. The one the rain chose. But Aanda never claimed a title. She never needed one. The rain knew her. And wherever it flowed, it carried her story. The palace, once the seat of power, slowly faded into memory. The queen was never seen again. Some said she wandered mad, whispering apologies to puddles. The king abdicated, leaving the throne to a council of truth-tellers chosen not by blood but by integrity. It was Aanda's doing, even though her feet never crossed the palace again. Her absence was more powerful than any presence. Years passed. And yet, Aanda did not age like others. Some said she was no longer flesh and bone. That she had become mist and cloud, thunder and breath. Others said she still walked among them, barefoot and cloaked in rain, visiting villages too small to matter to kings. In some places she was seen feeding stray dogs. In others she was just a shadow beside a well listening. Always listening. One day, a child born during a storm looked out her window and asked her mother, "Why is the rain singing my name?" The mother smiled through tears. "Because she hears you." That night, the child dreamt of a woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, standing in a storm that didn't wet her clothes. And when she awoke, her voice was clearer than ever before. She sang, and her song reached places she hadn't seen, echoing through wind and wave. Some say Aanda became the rain. That she dissolved into the clouds and returned each time a lie was spoken aloud. That her tears now form rivers. That her breath moves branches. That her footsteps are the thunder we hear before justice strikes. Others say she still walks among us, quiet, watching, waiting. Her voice doesn't come from her lips anymore. It comes from the skies. From the rustle of leaves. From the hush before a downpour. But everyone agrees on one thing. The girl who was once tied to a post, humiliated and silenced, now speaks more clearly than any queen, any priest, any king ever did. The rain listens. The rain remembers. And Aanda, child of storm and sorrow, became not a queen, not a ghost, but a promise. A promise that truth cannot be buried. That the silenced will sing again. That justice, like the rain, will fall, again and again until the world remembers how to listen. And so, when the skies darken and the first drops hit the ground, children still lift their faces to the storm and whisper, "She's here." Mothers clasp their infants close and say, "She's watching." And those who've done wrong, they hear the dripping in their dreams and they know. Aanda lives on, not as a memory, but as every drop that falls when the world dares to forget her.